Hi, Lane.
How are you?
Great. And we're in the company of about 300 teachers from every corner of the globe. I think Antarctica is probably the only place that we don't have anybody at the moment. So we've got a fantastic, truly global audience for you today. So it's my pleasure to introduce Lane to you. Lane is the language columnist and editor at The Economist, and he's um, currently based in London, but has worked in Berlin and New York, and the author of two books, Talk on the Wild Side and You Are What You Speak. I was lucky enough to see Lane talk recently, and I begged him to come and do a talk for you because it was a fascinating talk that I attended. And we've just been chatting before about my big passion is blues music, and I'm very jealous because Lane has grown up in the southern states of America, born in Tennessee and grew up in Georgia, where all my music heroes are from. So, Lane, it's great to have you here. We're all English language teachers, and we know as English language teachers that the English language at times is frustratingly complex and at other times seems to be ridiculously simple. And I know that you're here to explain why throughout history English has become the language it is now and why it is so tricky for students to learn. So big welcome, Lane, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Mike. I'm really excited to see so many people from so many different parts of the world that are passionate about teaching and about language and English, which is my great passion as well. There's a lot I want to get through, and I tend to get very excited, and I tend to speak quickly, so I'll have to slow myself down sometimes to contain my excitement. But I'm going to do a bit of a historical tour of English, explain where the language came from, what kind of language it is, and how it became how it is today, because it's changed its nature hugely over the course of its history, especially over the course of about the last 1,300, 1,200 years. Now, every language is always changing at every level of analysis. The sounds of our language are slowly changing. New words are coming into being, and other words are disappearing. And existing words, they change in meaning. So words don't mean what they used to. Grammar changes as well, and we're going to look at two elements of that. One is morphology, which is how words are built out of smaller pieces, and one is syntax, which is how bigger units, sentences, are built from words. But first, like I say, I kind of want to rattle through a bit of English history, and that's both the history of England, the country, and English, the language. In about 500 AD, so 500 years after the sort of birth of Christ and Roman Empire period, we have a group of people called the Anglo-Saxons today who conquered England, and they conquered the pre-existing people there, the Celts. And they came speaking their language, which is closely related to modern German. Not long after that, another conquest happened, this time from the east and from people from Denmark, and they came and conquered large parts of the country, and they spoke their language, Old Norse, which has become modern Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian. People from that same region later conquered Normandy in northern France, and those Normans matter because 100 years later, they have learned to speak French, and 150 or so years later, they in turn will conquer England yet again, and they will bring a third language, their Northern Norman French. And then I'll talk a little bit about the what's so-called Inkhorn era, where lots of new words in English were created and coined. And then, of course, in the last couple centuries of the second millennium, Britain conquered much of the world and built a very large empire, places like India and places like Burma, but also parts of Africa and the Middle East and elsewhere. And a huge amount of English comes from all of those places. North America, my part of the country, is, of course, a former British colony as well. So why don't we speak a language called British? Well, when those Anglo-Saxons I mentioned showed up in around 500 AD, they conquered a people that are generally called Britons, Briton with an O, and spoke what are called Brittonic languages. Those Brittonic languages are part of a larger family of Celtic languages, and those Celtic languages today include Scots Gaelic, They include Irish, Welsh, Manx, Cornish, and Breton spoken in France. These are the modern Celtic languages, and those dominated England before the Anglo-Saxons showed up. But when the Anglo-Saxons conquered England, they utterly wiped out those Celtic languages in England itself. They replaced the Celtic languages almost entirely with their Germanic language. And as a result, English has very little Celtic in it. For a country that had been entirely Celtic just a century before, the Anglo-Saxons took on very little of their vocabulary. I've listed here a few words that came from Celtic into English, words like ass and basket, bannock, crag, dun, but these are not many words, and they're not really basic words. They're not the core vocabulary. We got very little Celtic into what became English. So we get the name English from those Angles. The Angles were part of the Anglo-Saxons. The name comes from there. That comes from the Germans that came over and conquered, and it doesn't come from the Britons. So we speak a Germanic language, the Anglo-Saxon that they brought with them, those invaders from Germany and southern Denmark and the modern Netherlands. That's the language we speak today. It's been in this island that I'm in right now for 1,500 years. That is the base language. We speak a Germanic language. It is related to Dutch and German, I would say, as a sort of brotherly relationship. And it's related to, at one remove, to languages like Swedish and Norse. And it's related to the other European languages as well. But at its heart, it is a Germanic language. And I have here a bit of one of the great texts of Old English. Anglo-Saxon and Old English are roughly the same thing. And this is the poem called Beowulf, which is written down around 800 AD, but was composed probably a little earlier. And you can see that the language I'm speaking today has almost nothing to do with this text that you're seeing at the top here. What we gardena in gardagum, fer kuninga thrum gefrun hu the ethlingas ellen fremedon. I'm not even sure if I pronounced that correctly. This is a different language. Like I've said, we're speaking that language, but in 1,500 years, it has changed so much that it is essentially a foreign language. That said, if you look more closely, you can see a lot of correspondences between that Old English and today's modern English. If you look at the blue words I've highlighted here, you see words like we, which is completely unchanged. Dana is Danes. The word dog, it means days. So we see both words starting with a D-A sound. That gear, G-E-A-R, becomes your. If you say gear, year, it's that G becomes softened and becomes like a y. So gear becomes your. Kuninga there with the C-Y-N becomes the modern word kings. We see who becomes how, the becomes those, and so forth. And I highlighted the word theod just because it's interesting to me. Theod means clan or people. And if any of you know German, theod becomes the root of the word Deutsch in German. Deut means people, and theod and Deut are the same word. Theod, deod, deud, Deutsch. So theod gives us the modern word for German in German itself. So we can see these connections between Germanic languages on the continent and English. Now, the next big conquest was the Vikings. And if I said if German and Dutch are brothers to English, then the Vikings are more like cousins. They're closely related, but not as closely related. And when the Vikings came, they conquered a lot of eastern and northern England. And then the English sort of successfully stopped them from getting any further. So you can divide England in kind of two parts, where one part in the north and the east speaks has heavy influence from those Vikings. And in the south and in the west, we have relatively little influence. But that said, the Vikings gave the English language a huge amount of its vocabulary. You can see that they're violent conquerors because they gave us a lot of violent words, words like berserk, club, gun and knife, ransack and slaughter. But it wasn't all violent words. They also gave us words like law and husband and window. something really profound is that they gave us very basic words in English as well. They gave us words like she and they. Words, languages don't usually borrow their pronouns from other languages. This is very unusual. So we can see that the Vikings had a very intimate influence on English, and they gave us words. I don't know why the English had to borrow them from Vikings. We borrowed words like awkward and bag and neck. And finally, most of the days of the week come from Old Norse. Tuesday is named after the Norse god Tu. Wednesday is named after the Norse god Woden or Odin. Thursday is named after Thor, if you've seen any of the Thor movies. And Friday is named after the goddess Freya. Now, I mentioned that the languages are something like cousins or brothers because Anglo-Saxon and Norse together, they make up the biggest, deepest, oldest layers of vocabulary in English. They're so close that you can see that they often gave us the same word twice. The word shirt, like I have on here, comes from German, from Anglo-Saxon, but the word skirt is the same word in Old Norse, and it just has a slight sound change. Sh becomes sk in the Scandinavian languages, and because we borrowed the word again, it came to have a different meaning, a part of piece of clothing that we wear on the lower body. And you can see that same alternation in ship, which we took from Anglo-Saxon, and skiff, which is the Norse version of the same word. And a skiff is like a small boat, and a ship is a sort of big sailing vessel. So you can see we borrowed those words twice. You can see how deeply Germanic English is when you look at words that are the same in English, Danish, and German. That DE is for German, DA is for Danish. So apple, Äble, Apfel. And you can see how it's nothing at all like the French word, which I put in brackets, pomme. Same goes with bread, brød, brot, or house, hus, house. You can see how close English, Danish, and German are, whereas the French word in brackets each time is quite distinct and different. This is just all goes to say how deeply Germanic the English language is. But the next thing that happened is that in 1066, those Vikings that had conquered Normandy and had learned Northern Norman French, they in turn conquer England again. In 1066, they decisively defeated the Anglo-Saxon English armies and took the throne, with William the Conqueror becoming the first Norman king of England. Now, they in turn bring a huge layer of vocabulary of their own. They bring thousands and thousands and thousands of words into the English language. For centuries, the English kings did not speak English themselves. They spoke French. They spoke French to the people around them. They surrounded themselves with other Normans and didn't even bother to learn English for a couple of centuries. Then there was a period where they were bilingual, and it's only in about the 1300s that the Norman kings started speaking English on a regular basis. Those Normans brought lots of words from the French language, and so if any of you know French, you'll recognize some of these words. And you can see that these go into kind of high domains. The reason I say posh people is because they didn't bring words like knife and egg like the Vikings. They brought words into fancy domains like law and religion, into the military, and into fashion. So if you see these words like pardon and justice and prison, they look just like the modern French words justice, pardon, prison. You can see in religion words like chaplain and incense and ordain very clearly have a French feel. Military words, army and combat and defend, all come from French. And of course, these words from fashion and the arts. So the Normans brought a kind of higher layer of vocabulary. You can almost think of Germanic down here, and the French layer goes on top. We still are a Germanic language at the base, but on top of that comes a higher language that has a posher vocabulary. A good example of this is that the English peasants, the Anglo-Saxon peasants, would live closely with their animals. And in modern English, those animal words are still, they come from the English, the Old English. These are Germanic words like ox, pig, sheep, deer, and calf. But the French They got to eat lots of meat back in these days when eating meat was expensive and rare. And so our words for the food come from French. Beef, pork, mutton, venison, and veal are the food-related words for those animal terms we just mentioned: ox, pig, sheep, deer, and calf. So the fancy words, when it's on your table and you're eating it with a fork and knife, you use a French word. When you're living with the animals and raising them, you use an English word. So we see lots of doublets where we have an English word and a French word. And I'll come back to that concept of doublets in a moment. Here we have lots of words that are either exact synonyms, close synonyms, or have come to be quite distinct, but they are Germanic on the left and Anglo-Norman French on the right. We have words like begin and commence, child and infant, doom and judgment, freedom and liberty, hearty, cordial, help and aid, and so on down the list. And in each case, the word on the left comes from Anglo-Saxon, is Germanic, and is considered a more basic word. If you're teaching vocabulary, you'll teach these words on the left first. You'll learn begin before you'll learn commence. You'll learn wish before you'll learn desire. You'll learn help before you will learn aid. So these are the basic words on the left. In some cases, these two words mean almost exactly the same thing. To begin and commence have virtually no difference, but commence is a little bit fancier. You'll use it in more elevated circumstances. In some cases, the words have become distinct. A child might be 12 or 14 years old. An infant is only maybe 1 to 2 to 3 or 4 years old. Okay. And so we see in some cases they've come to have very distinct meanings. Doom and judgment are certainly very different today, but doom is just the old Norse and German word for to judge someone. So those have come to be very different, but in the old days they were an English-French pair. And there's lots of these doublets all over, with the fancy word always being the French one. Now, after the Normans conquered England, they decided that they wanted to take lots of fancy words from Latin, because at this time, English was still not commonly written. And in Europe, nearly all important scholarship and fancy work was done not in the vernacular languages, Italian, German, Spanish, or French. They were done in Latin. It was still the language of teaching and learning. And so when people did have to write fancy things in English, there was a period of using Latin's roots to coin lots of new words in English. So these are sort of NeoLatin. They're medieval Latin, 1,000 years after the end of the Roman Empire, and these words are brought into English. Once again, we see that they go into high domains, not words like food or family relationships, but they come into domains like the law and learning or scholarship and religion. So we see words like homicide in law, or we see words like history and library in learning. And in religion, sorry, I have pulpit twice there. In religion, words like diocese and infinite obviously come from Latin. So we see yet another layer. We have Germanic, French, and on top of that, Latin. In about the 16th century, English and other scholars rediscovered the joys of the Greek language as well, and the old culture of Greece that had had so much learning and scholarship and philosophy. And so they started to coin words in Greek as well as in Latin. And so we see fancy words like anachronism and catastrophe and enthusiasm, idiosyncrasy, monopoly. All of these words come from Greek more or less directly. We borrowed them from Greek. However, people also started to invent words in English based on Greek and Latin roots. These are words that didn't exist in Greek and Latin, but they were built in English on the basis of Greek and Latin. So they came up with fancy words, things like mundane and celebrate and dexterity and illustrate. This is called the inkhorn era because people used a horn of ink to dip their pen into and write these fancy words. And in this inkhorn era, they created lots and lots of words on those Greek and Latin roots. They created lots that survived and succeeded. Those at the top of the list, like ingenious and capacity and mundane. But they also created many words that did not survive in English. Words like deruncinate and eximius and suppeditate. Those are coinages that didn't make it. But we now have multiple layers: Germanic, French, Latin, and now Greek, and now new words from that Inkhorn period, all contributing to the huge vocabulary of English. This means that English has many synonyms and many near synonyms, and they often come even in pairs of 3. I call these triplets here because we have often 3 words that are very closely related. The word kingly comes from Germanic, related to the word king. The word royal comes from French. It looks just like the modern French royal. And the word regal comes from Latin. They're all closely related, but they're slightly distinct. You'd use royal and regal and kingly in different circumstances. And we see other triplets: holy, sacred, and consecrated. Again, in each case, the first word is Germanic, the second word is French, and the third word comes from Latin. Ask, question, interrogate, rise, mount, and ascend. Again, German, French, Latin in each case. In some cases, we borrowed the same word 3 times. We borrowed the word captain via French. Captain went straight from Latin into French, and we borrowed it in that form. But the French had also shortened that word into a Middle French word, chief, and we borrowed it a second time in the Norman period. And then just in recent centuries, that word had changed from chief into chef in modern French, and we borrowed it a third time. Captain, chief, and chef are all from the same Latin root. We got one via Latin, we got one via Old French, and we got one via modern French. They have different meanings. A captain is a military rank, or the head of a soccer club. A chief is something like a tribal leader, and a chef is the head specifically of a kitchen in English. Okay. And we borrowed another triplet, words like fidelity, faithfulness, and fealty. Same root. You can see they all start with F. We borrowed one from Latin. We borrowed one from Norman French, that French spoken in the north by the conquerors. And then we borrowed the third one from the French of Paris. Same root, same word, borrowed 3 different times. So this kind of thing can really make English a challenge to learn, because there are so many synonyms, words that have similar or exactly the same meaning, and they also look the same. When should you use fidelity, and when should you use faithfulness, and when should you use fealty? It's not at all obvious. This makes English teaching a vocabulary very difficult. Languages also change over time, and I started out with saying that languages are also changing, and I wanted to just look at one word that's a favorite case of mine, the word buxom. Now, if you know this word, you can imagine it in your mind. If you don't know it, don't Google it while other people are looking at your screen. Buxom in modern English essentially means a woman who has large breasts. If you'll excuse that, that is the word buxom in its modern meaning. But Samuel Johnson, one of the great dictionary writers in English, writing about 300 years ago, said that it meant obedient, and that it had now come to mean things like wanton. And he said that wives used to promise their husbands, I will be bon air and buxom in bed and at board. So how did the word buxom come to mean big-breasted when it used to mean obedient? Well, we can see that a long time ago, buxom meant something like pliable or bendable. In its oldest form, it looked like Buxom, and that meant something that you can bend. And if a person is flexible or pliable and bendable, that means they're friendly and helpful. And so you might also consider them sort of amiable, like a good friend, affable. And if someone is amiable and affable, like a friend, then buxom goes on to mean something like lively and friendly and gay. So Shakespeare used the word buxom to mean something like lively or gay in his play, Henry V. And if someone is lively and gay, then they might also be robust and healthy and strong and plump. In the old days, it was good to be plump, i.e. a little bit heavier. That showed that you had plenty of food. And so someone who was in good health was plump, and plump or sort of heavy went on to mean heavy for a woman specifically, and then it went on specifically to mean heavy breasts. So we see lots of short steps in which Buxom has gone from meaning obedient a very, very long time ago to meaning big breasts today. Each one of those steps is a short one and a logical one, perhaps. Each extension is logical from the previous one, but taken together, the words have changed hugely. And so language change in meaning presents a challenge for learners of English as well. Other words like buxom include silly, which used to mean holy, and you can see how it came on to mean something like contemptible later on, and nice, which used to mean foolish, but now means something like respectable and then even friendly. We can see these all go through these series of steps until words come to mean something completely different. So that's how English vocabulary was built on these waves of conquest and centuries of change, and they make the vocabulary very rich. We have many, many synonyms and many choices when we want to write or speak English, but all of those choices, the great big stock of words, does make English more difficult to learn. The basic vocabulary may be pretty simple, but to get a richer vocabulary takes a lot of work because you have to learn words from very different languages. German and French are very different. Now I want to talk about sound in English, why my English might be difficult to pronounce. And in particular, this is a slightly European-focused section, but I'd like to talk about how English has changed. Sounds in languages are always changing, and in particular, English has gone through several vowel shifts. When I say a vowel shift, I'm talking about the vowels of the language all coming to be spoken in a slightly different way. And over time, they can come to be spoken in a lot of different ways. And linguists have identified a number of different vowel shifts. There's the so-called Great Vowel Shift. There's one going on in America called the Northern Cities Shift. There's the Californian shift. We see the language spoken here in London among the working class going from a variety called Cockney to one called multicultural London English. So the sounds of languages are changing all the time. But I want to look in detail at the Great Vowel Shift because this really changed how English sounds. Now, this little shape here is going to be a little bit confusing, but I will basically note that on the top left, you see the letter I, and in linguistics, that stands for the sound E. That means it's spoken at the top of your mouth with your tongue high, and your tongue is in the front of your mouth when you make an E sound. If you go down that side, you go from E, A, and A in the bottom left. E, A. Those are, your tongue is progressively going lower. E, A, E, A, right? Over on the right side, you see the tongue is in the back of the mouth, and that gives us our vowels oo, o, ah. And you can see my mouth is opening. It goes oo, o, ah, high, middle, low. Ooh, oh, ah. Ooh, oh, ah. Yeah? So the ones on the left have the tongue in the front. The ones on the right have the tongue in the back. And the ones on the top have the tongue high. And the ones in the bottom have the tongue low. A little bit complicated. But these are the basic vowels of English. E, A, and in the back, oo, o, ah. And in the middle, we have things like A, O, I, ow, and ah. Okay? The point of this story is that once upon a time, all of the English letters used to basically be pronounced in their European-style ways. In English, the letter on the top left here used to be pronounced E, just as it is in French. You can say Nice or something like that. In German, you'd say Berlin. You know, that letter I had an E sound in French, in German, in Spanish, and in English. The letter E, the next one down, had a sound just like the European ones did. A. It sounded like A, and so on. What happened in the Great Vowel Shift is that all of the English vowels changed in how they're pronounced. They all moved so that now the letter on the top left is called I. In every European language, it's called E, but in English, it's called I. That next letter down, in every European language, it's called A, except in English, where it's called E. Over there on the right, we see a couple of different changes. The point is every vowel in the English system moved. First, we see the number 1 indicating the first change, where E became something more like A, and U became something more like O. Then we get a second change. The letter E moves up to I's old spot. So A goes into E's old place. And over on the right, O moves into U's old place. And then we get 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7, a very complex series of changes that took several centuries to occur. But the point is that every vowel ended up in a new place. So if you're familiar with how these letters are used in virtually every language in the world, you get a vowel set that looks like A, E, O, U in German, Spanish, French, and even when we write languages like Arabic or Chinese, A, E, O, U are the basic values of those vowels. But in English, they've come to have very different names. We say A, E, I, O, U. Completely different from A, E, O, U. So that's one of the reasons English pronunciation is so difficult and different from the rest of the language. When you look at the vowels on the page, you see a very different sound than you get in all of English's cousin languages in Europe. English spelling is famously difficult not only because of the great vowel shift, which I mentioned, but I want to mention a couple of other reasons English spelling became very difficult. We talked about the Normans and their huge influence on English. Well, they were some of the first people to start writing English for serious purposes. And many of the spellings that are known from British English, like honor with an OU or color with an OU, those endings came from the influence of French. The Normans were doing their best to write English in the way that they had written French. So they heard a sound and they used the closest French equivalent. 1,000 years later, we don't speak French in England anymore, and the language has changed quite a bit, but we're still stuck with these old Norman spellings of English words. Sometimes what I call etymological conservatism was the culprit. The word debt has never been pronounced with a B sound in it. We've never said debt ever in English. The word used to be spelled det, D-E-T-T-E, just like it sounds. But the word debt goes 1,000 years back further into Latin, where it came from the word debita. In Latin, the B was pronounced debita. It was never pronounced English. It had become debt over 1,000 years of natural change. But when people first wrote the word, they said, well, we know this word comes from debita, so let's put a silent B into debt. And that's how the modern spelling D-E-B-T emerged. Okay, I'm so sorry, folks. I'll carry on. I'll try not to speed up too much, but I was explaining how English spelling got weird, and I'll move past that quickly. But basically, the Normans made it more French than it should be. They added a lot of Latin letters that had long since disappeared, but stuck them in there because they wanted the words to look like Latin. And sometimes they even made mistakes. They thought the word island came from Latin insula, and so they stuck an S in there. But it didn't come from insula. It came from a German root. And that's how we got a silent S in island. That S has never been pronounced. So moving right on. Grammar. Let's talk about how English became the kind of language it is. We see lots of changes from the English of 1,000 years ago to today. For example, we've lost a lot of what are called inflections, what normal people would call endings. We are losing the word whom and replacing it with who. We've also seen other changes like the loss of a distinction between a formal you and an informal you. It used to be we said thou to one person, we said you to one person whom we respected, and we said ye to a group of people. Now we just have one pronoun, which is you. And we see some other changes here, which I won't have time to get into at this point, which have also made English a little difficult. But I'll mention a couple of words like gotta, shoulda, woulda, coulda. You probably don't teach these as grammatical words in your classes because this is how the language is spoken. We don't say gotta, but every one of your English students, when they speak to a native English speaker, will hear things like, I gotta go. They haven't heard gotta in anywhere in their vocabulary lists, but this is how people say, I have to go, or I need to go. So these changes, new words and changes to old words, present a challenge to the learner as well. Whom is disappearing. This is a little screen grab from Twitter. And as you can see, Twitter even suggests who to follow and not the traditional whom to follow. People who are professional grammarians, like me, for example, or editors or writers, still use whom, but ordinary people don't. So we have one of those rules that is observed by a minority, but the majority don't use whom basically ever. What happened to whom? We're back to Beowulf here. Go back to one of my earlier slides and the language of about 1,000 years ago. In that English, we see that some of the irregular words in modern English came from features of the ancient language. Why does man in the singular become men in the plural, not man, mans? Well, this goes back to even before Old English. The old was called Proto-Germanic, the language that was even older than Old English and gave us Old English. In Old English, the plural was manes, manes, manes. And man was the singular, manes was the plural. However, the E sound in manes changed the ah sound. If you think about it, ah, e, manes, takes a lot of work to move your mouth from here, ah, to here, e. So people didn't want to say manes, and they made it easier to pronounce and said manes, manes. Now, the two vowels are not so different. Manes is easier to say than manes. And in saving that effort and in changing the ah to an a, they no longer needed the e's because now the eh sound did the work of marking the plural. So we no longer need the e's ending because now we have the distinction between one mon and two menes, and we can lose the e's. One mon, two men. One mon, two men in modern English. One man, two men in modern English. That's where those oddball irregular plurals come from. The same thing happened for faute and faute. Faute is the old plural, one faute, two faute. Well, faute became futi and then fiti, and then we no longer need the E at the end, and so O becomes E. In English, the noun used to be incredibly complicated. If you speak a language like Russian or Ukrainian, as I know many of you do, or Arabic or some of those others, you'll be used to a noun having many different forms. They have many endings on the end that signal what the function of the word is. And you also have, in many of those languages, you have multiple genders. Like Russian, English has masculine, neuter, and feminine 1,000 years ago. So words like engel were masculine, skip was neuter, and sorg was feminine. Not only that, but we had 4 cases. Case is a word that we use for languages like Latin and Greek and Russian, where words have lots of different forms based on how they are used in a sentence. The nominative case is for the subject of a sentence. An angel came here. The genitive is for the possessor, so the angel's wings. And the dative is like if you're giving something to the angel or you're saying something to the angel. Well, we can see from our table that has 3 forms. Engel, that's the nominative, and also the accusative, which means I saw the angel. the angle's wings, we'd say. And then angle would mean like I talked to the angel. You'd say I spoke to the angle, right? And in the plural, we get more complexity. Anglas, angla, anglum. Ship had the forms skip, skipe, skipe, skipu, skipa, skipum. And feminine sorg was sorg, sorge, sorga, sorga, sorge, sorga, sorgum. Very complicated, right? This looks like Russian or Greek. Today, the English noun looks like this. Angel, angels, angels, angels. Just two pronunciations, angel and angels, and two slightly different forms with an apostrophe. We've lost all the genders and have only one gender for nouns, and we've got only two forms left. All of the nominative, accusative, and dative are the same. And then we have the distinctive form angels for the genitive, the angel's wings or the angel's message. Similarly, Old English verbs used to be extremely complicated. An English verb like to heal, heilan, had many forms. Heilan would be the infinitive, and heilane, and you'd say ik heila, I heal. Thu heilst, you heal. He heilth, he heals. And in the plural, you'd say they hail off. And in the past, heilde, heilest, heildon, heile, heilen, heile, heilden, hail, hailoff, heilende, and gehailed. The English had many, many forms for any single verb, just like Russian or Spanish or Portuguese today. That verb is now this: healed, heal, healed, and healing. Just four simple forms. So in this sense, English has become much, much more simple than it used to be. However, this is not always easier. Why is it now tricky in a way that English no longer tells you why is it a bad thing for some learners that things became so much simpler? The verb is simpler, the noun is simpler, but now it's hard to tell what word in the sentence is a verb and what word is a noun. So for example, I have some sort of trick sentences here. Fat people eat accumulates that don't seem to make sense. The old man, the boat. And the fact is that these sentences actually do work. So fat people eat accumulates means that the fat that people eat accumulates on their body. It does make sense, but it doesn't seem to make sense because you look at the thing fat people and you think fat is an adjective. In fact, in this sentence, fat is a noun. And so the fact that we can't tell what's an adjective and what's a noun makes English ambiguous in many cases, like this tricky, weird sentence. The old man, the boat. Now, in this sentence, it's not the old man as a noun phrase, a very common one. We're saying the old people, and then man here is a verb, meaning to run the boat or to control the boat. So we're saying the old are the crew on the boat, and we're saying the old people, man as a verb, the boat. So the reason we're confused is because we're used to man being a noun, but man is also a verb. I've translated that sentence into German, die Alten bemannen das Schiff. And in this case, every word in this sentence tells you, it screams what kind of word it is. Die is an article. Alten is capitalized. So now we know that it's a noun. That capital letter in German signals that it's a noun. The N at the end says it's a plural noun. Bemannen has an en ending on there that says, I'm a verb, I'm a verb. Das is another article. And then Schiff again comes with a capital letter that says, I'm a noun, I'm a noun. So we have signals all over the German. I'm an article, I'm a verb, I'm a noun, I'm a plural, I'm a singular, I'm a masculine. English has lost all of that stuff, which makes it easier to learn in one respect, but it also makes it much more ambiguous. I'm going to finish up by saying that language is full of trade-offs. Languages that have lots of inflection, like all those endings in Old English or in Russian, give you lots of signpostings. I'm a noun, I'm a verb, I'm an adjective, I'm an adverb, I'm plural, I'm singular. They give you lots of signposting. They give you lots of signals of what those words do, but those signs are very many, and so they're very difficult to learn. You have a big memorization job to learn all of the forms that a verb can take and that a noun can take, and so on. English is one of those languages, and it's a little bit like, I saw some folks from China and Vietnam in there, where there's almost nothing in the way of endings. We have very simple, short words that don't have endings. And they're easier to learn the individual words, but you have to know a lot more context to figure out ambiguous situations when a sentence can mean more than one thing. And knowing context is exactly what foreign learners don't do. They don't have the context. When they're in a new situation, meeting a new person, they can be easily confused because we don't have a shared context. Native speakers share a context with each other. They're friends and they've spoken the language all their lives. But a newcomer to the language will struggle because those simpler words in English don't signal what function they're performing. You have to figure it out from context. So my last slide. Most languages are easy for their native speakers. English is not hard for me, but it will be for many of you who have learned it as a second language. Languages are relatively easier for small children to learn, but they're difficult. Almost any language is difficult in an older era of learning. If you're learning after puberty, say, if you start at sort of 15 or 20, learning any language is more difficult. Learning a language is always easier if it's related to your first language. So if you're German, English is easier to learn than if you are Korean, which has almost nothing to do with English. All languages can do pretty much anything. All languages are what I call fully functional. They have some hard bits and they have some English easy bits. They have some complexity and they have some places where they're simple. But most all languages can do anything given the basic toolkit of complexity that they come with. But in English's case in particular, I would describe this mixing, English's history of being conquered again and again, Celts, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, Normans, and then the creation of those layers of vocabulary from French, Latin, Greek, and then the colonial era where we took words from Spanish, Italian, Native American languages, Indian languages. This has created an extraordinarily mixed language. And it has simplified the grammar in some ways, but it has made the spelling incredibly confusing. All those foreign words are sometimes spelled in either a traditional way, which makes them hard to read in English, or their spelling has been changed, which makes it confusing to see the etymology. And so for many other reasons, English has become incredibly complicated. So with that, I'll start to look at some of your questions. I'm sorry, there are hundreds of you, so I won't be able to get to everyone. But I'll try, now is a good time to type a question in, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. We'll take about 10 minutes if that's, Mike, is that okay, 10 more minutes?
Yeah, so just before we get to the questions, guys, and Lane, thanks a million for a fascinating session. I trained to be a teacher 20 years ago, and I know I don't look old enough, guys. And I'm only finding this out now, so I'm quite annoyed, Lane, that you weren't involved in my initial teacher training. But it's good to learn even 20 years too late. It's absolutely fascinating stuff. And just before we get to questions, I want to remind everybody, you get a beautiful Advancing Learning certificate for attending today's session, and we will send that directly to your email inbox, so you don't need to do anything at all. And I'm sure that you want to share all of Lane's insights with your colleagues. We will be uploading the recording of this, and you can check next week on our website, and you can access the recording. So do tell your colleagues so they can watch this as well. And before we get to the questions, I just want to say a big thank you to Federica, who works here at Macmillan and does all of the work. I was about to say all of the hard work, all of the work that goes into the webinars. And so a big thank you to her. And please do join us again on the 20th for the next webinar. But we've got a few minutes now for some questions. So anybody have any questions for Lane?
Okay, I see lots coming in. So let me try to take them one at a time. They're moving faster than I can see them almost. Okay, so there's a question about the past tense. So I mentioned irregular plurals like man and men. And there's a question from Yadira about how we got the irregular past tense of some verbs like see, saw, and seen. This is a complicated story, but I'll try to shorten it quickly. Why did those vowels change? Why would somebody change a vowel? What usually happened is something like what happened in the case of man and men, which is that there used to be an ending on there. It would have been something like see and then see on, and then the on made it sound something like saw on, because the first vowel wants to change to be more like the second vowel. And once you've changed the first vowel, then you no longer need the ending, and so the ending falls off. So those irregular plural or those irregular past tenses came around same way that our irregular plurals did, which is they're a relic of an old change that we can no longer see. They happen in prehistory before we even have written examples, because it seems like a very strange way to make a past tense, and it is a strange way to make a past tense. And the answer is nobody created it that way. It's an artifact of another change that we can no longer see directly. Eduardo Jose says, can we mix posh words and popular words in a sentence? That's a great question. I think so. What I would caution against is trying to lean too heavy on the posh vocabulary. The posh words stand out and are most effective when they're used sparingly. Students, and I mean English-speaking students even, learn these fancy words like the Greek and Latin and French-based ones, and then they go a little crazy trying to use them because they sound impressive. But a good English style is built on those old layers of vocabulary, the Germanic layers, with a sort of sprinkling, a bit of spice from those posh words, the French and Greek and Latin ones. So absolutely you can mix them. We don't have a sense that like there's one register that has only the old words and another register that has the new ones. We don't have the strict separation like that. But I would say use the posh words as a spice, not as the main thing. That's a great question. Thank you. There's a question from Michael Birch about dialectal variation. Was there dialectal variation in Old English? And the answer is yes. There was the Wessex dialect, which was the main source of Old English texts. The great kings were in a place called Wessex to the southwest of London. But what became modern English actually came from the so-called Mercian dialect, which is sort of north and in the Midlands. And we also had Northumberland in the far north. And so, yes, 1,000 years ago, English was very different depending on the region you came from. And that dialectal mixing gave us some different forms of words. And so for that reason, English has a bit of a mixed nature from the fact that it had so many different dialects. Let's see, is there any relationship between...
There were a couple of questions directly about you, Lane.
Oh, okay. Well,
when are you going to visit Moscow and give some presentations to the teachers in Moscow? That was
I'll combine when are you going to visit Moscow with how many languages do you speak? Because I would say I speak between 7 and 9. And the reason I say between 7 and 9, if you're wondering how do you not know how many languages you speak, the answer is the last two are the most difficult for me. They're Russian and Arabic. And I have learned them extensively. I've studied them very extensively. But I've never spent time in those countries. So I haven't spent that time, those hours practicing with native speakers. And that is, for me, the real way you learn a language, not by study, but by use. You need to do the study first, but then you use the language in context with native speakers wherever possible. And those hours of practice with the native speaker are the way you really get there. And so I would love to come to Moscow as soon as I can, is the answer to your question. And if I spend those 25 hours in conversation with Russians, I will speak fluent Russian. I speak pretty good Russian now. But if you sat down and had to talk to me for an hour, you would find that after 20 minutes, I was starting to struggle because I was trying to say new things, and my vocabulary would start to get thin, and I would have trouble with certain expressions that are used to say complicated things. And so you have all the base, and I've got all the base in Russian and Arabic, and more than the base probably, but I haven't got all that depth, that real depth that comes from use. And so Russian and Arabic are the ones I'm still building on. And I want to spend time in those countries precisely to build them up, because I love both languages. They're beautiful, they're difficult, and they're fascinating to me.
Well, you now have friends in Russia who would happily practice, help you
All
practice.
right, great. There are also many great online resources. There are very many exchanges for people who want to get together and practice each other's languages. Two people speak a different language and want to practice with the other. So if your students are interested in that kind of thing, that's something I recommend. There's a question about phrasal verbs, and I thought this might come up, and I didn't get a chance to mention phrasal verbs. For those of you who don't know, although most of you as teachers probably will, English has lots of verb phrases like put up with, or take out, or shut up, where they consist of multiple words, and the preposition in there often doesn't seem to make any sense. To shut up means to be quiet, but there's no up involved in shutting up. So where do those come from, and when did they come? I don't know the specific answer to that. I meant to try to research that, and I didn't have some time. But Old English had lots more endings and prefixes that did a lot of that work. And as those started to disappear, I suspect what happened is you had to take freestanding prepositions, words like up and with and down and to, and you had to add them to basic verbs like shut. And so you take shut, you add up, and you get a new phrasal verb. What makes it a phrasal verb? You have to know shut up as a unit. You can't learn the meaning of shut and learn the meaning of up and understand shut up, because you would think that means to like close something up there, and it doesn't make any sense as that. So you have to learn shut up as what dictionary writers, lexicographers in English call a lexicalized unit. Shut up is not two words, it's really one thing. And you've got to learn it that way. And I think it comes from the stripping away of a lot of those endings meant that we lost some complexity. And when you lose complexity, the system needs it to reemerge somewhere else. And that's what my latest book is about. It's about how languages change, and when they often lose complexity here, they will gain it over there in a new way. That book is called Talk on the Wild Side, if you're interested in the book. And a lot of it is how language change seems chaotic. And yet languages lose something here and they make up for it here. And they always keep a lot of complexity in the system, because the system of the language needs complexity in order for the language to be expressive enough to do all the fun things a language needs to do. Let's see, there's good questions all over the place.
I think, Elaine, we've probably got time for one more question. And then we'll let
Mike, I'm looking at lots of great ones. Let's see.
Well, actually, somebody did ask if you had any recommended reading. So obviously, there's your own book that you've just mentioned. Is there anything else you would recommend?
So many books.
Yeah.
On the nature of English, there's one that springs to mind. Is by my friend John McWhorter, and it's called Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue. And it's about the bastard references to the mixing of sort of, that word means a child of two parents who aren't married. And it refers to all those conquests that I talked about. In particular, he puts a big emphasis on the role of Scandinavian and the Viking conquests of English. And he looks at that and at those waves of conquest and how they created English in particular. And that's a fun book about English. And if you want to learn more about these processes generally, John McWhorter also wrote a book called The Power of Babel. And I'll put the name of that in here. The Power of Babel is in the chat. And Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue are both by John McWhorter. And those are two great books for learning about a lot of this stuff. And then my favorite book about just introducing linguistics, which gives you such a rich insight into how language works, is still The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker. This is the book that got me to absolutely fall in love with this subject myself. So those are a couple of recommended books that I absolutely love, and they'll lead you on so many other intellectual journeys that you might want to follow. So thank you again. I'm sorry about the internet, but I've really enjoyed this, and thank you for your great questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to more of them, but I hope you guys have enjoyed it. I know that I've enjoyed doing it.
I think I speak on behalf of everyone to say that we've had a wonderful time learning lots, and guys, do look out for Lane's books as well. You Are What You Speak and Talk on the Wild Side, and let your colleagues know about the recording, which will be available. And also we're doing the session again at 4 p.m. UK time today. Lane, on behalf of everyone at Macmillan Education, a huge thank you for what's been a fascinating session. And I think I might be in touch to see if we can get you back in the next season for another webinar. So thank you so much.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you, Mike.